Good morning, everyone. I am Camilo Gonzalez Velasquez. I am honored to host today's session of the Thyroid by MD's webinar series. We're thrilled to bring forward another important discussion at the intersection of thyroid disease and public health. Today, we will be discussing on the focusing on the association between environmental air pollution and thyroid cancer and nodules based on a recent publication from a leading research group. Our presenter today, Dr. Aarti Mathur, is an associate professor of surgery and oncology at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where she also serves as associate vice chair for faculty development. Dr. Mathur completed her medical training at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas, and surgical residency at Georgetown, followed by fellowship in endocrine surgery at Johns Hopkins. Her clinical practice is focused on thyroid, parathyroid, and adrenal disorders as she directs the endocrine surgery fellowship program at Johns Hopkins. As an R01 funded surgeon scientist, Dr. Mathur leads a collaborative endocrine surgery research group studying everything from secondary hyperparathyroidism and transplant outcomes to environmental risk factors for thyroid cancer. She's published over 90 peer-reviewed articles and serves as an editorial of the Thyroid Journal, as well as an author team for UpToDate. She's also deeply involved in national societies, including leadership roles at the American Association of Endocrine Surgeons and the American Thyroid Association, where she contributes to the Environmental Task Force Writing Group. Joining us today as our expert discussant is Dr. Elizabeth Pearce, Professor of Medicine and Endocrinology Fellowship Program Director at Boston University School of Medicine. Dr. Pearce earned her medical degree and undergraduate training at Harvard, with additional training in epidemiology from Boston University. She completed her internal medicine residency at Beth Israel Deaconess and endocrinology fellowship at BU. Dr. Pearce is former president of the American Thyroid Association and is internationally known for her work in iodine nutrition, thyroid disease in pregnancy, and environmental endocrine disruptors. She's deputy editor of the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, JCNM, and co-chaired the 2017 ATA guidelines on thyroid in pregnancy, and currently serves as on a WHO guideline advisory panel on iodine assessment. Additionally, Dr. Pearce was the 2011 recipient of the ATA Van Meter Award for outstanding contributions to thyroid research, and in 2018, she was honored Woman in Thyroidology Woman of the Year. I'm extremely excited to hop on into this interesting discussion. Before we begin, I would like to distract your attention and invite all of you to listen to our podcast, Voices of Wisdom. Voices of Wisdom is a recent project that the TIRO group has put together, and we recently launched an episode on unresectable thyroid cancer by Dr. Mark Zaferi from MD Anderson. So I hope you join in your favorite podcast platform. Before we begin, I'd also like to invite all of our audience to send any questions that they might have through the Q&A function. I will try to get to as many of them by the end of the hour. So let's begin, Dr. Arthur. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. It is really an honor to be here this morning and to be able to share our work. So in the next half hour or so, I hope to provide a brief overview of thyroid cancer and kind of the change in management of thyroid cancer, describe environmental risk factors, and really focus on air pollution and its link to thyroid cancer. So thyroid cancer is the leading site of new cancer cases in adolescents and young adults. And when we think of thyroid cancer, the most common kinds that we think of are papillary and follicular, and that's what we refer to as our differentiated thyroid cancers. And typically they have an excellent prognosis. And therefore the management has really shifted, where we went from a one-size-fits-all approach to where everybody used to get a total thyroidectomy to now where we have a more personalized approach where we take into account tumor size and risk factors, such that if you're less than a centimeter, we now even consider active surveillance. Or we can consider a total thyroidectomy for over 4 centimeters, but less than that, we are okay doing a hemithyroidectomy if you're low risk. And when we think about these risk factors for thyroid cancer. There are non-modifiable, which we all know of family history and age and gender. But there are also modifiable risk factors, which have recently been studied, including obesity. And the most well-studied environmental risk factor that we've studied thus far is ionizing radiation exposure. And we unfortunately learned about ionizing radiation through 3 large nuclear disasters. And what we saw is that there was a significant increase in thyroid cancer, which was reported as soon as 4 to 5 years after Chernobyl, but up to 60 years afterwards. And some of these cancers were more aggressive. The Cancer Genome Atlas has taught us a lot about the molecular profiles of thyroid cancer, and we now know that there are BRAF-like and RAS-like cancers, and if you add a TERT mutation, it can get a little ugly. And I often think of the movie The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, and if you add TERT, it gets a little ugly. And radiation-induced thyroid cancers have a distinct molecular signature. We know that up to 90% post-Chernobyl showed a RET rearrangement. And the role of ionizing radiation as a risk factor is now incorporated into multiple guidelines to determine the extent of surgery for differentiated thyroid cancer. But we all know that the incidence of thyroid cancer has been on the rise. And although many have attributed this rise to an increase in detection and therefore overdiagnosis, as many of these cancers are detected incidentally, we've also seen a rise in not just smaller tumors or localized disease, but also an increase in incidence of regional disease and distant disease. And we've also seen a rise in the incidence of larger tumors. And so this would suggest that this is not purely increased detection and something else is going on. Additionally, if you look around the United States, there's a variation in the rise of thyroid cancer cases. And this is also true globally, where we see more than a 15-fold difference in incidence rates across different regions of the world. So what is responsible for these increasing rates of thyroid cancer? And this is the second most common question I get asked as a surgeon. My first is always, am I going to gain weight after my thyroid is resected? And the second is, why do I have this? And that's led a lot of people to look into endocrine disrupting chemicals. And these are really chemicals that mimic or block or interfere with hormones in the body's endocrine system. And they can disrupt a variety of functions, including thyroid function. They can also impact immunologic and neurologic systems. And there are about 1,000 of these chemicals that have been identified. They're present in nearly everybody at low doses. The interesting thing, though, is that the influence of these exposures really differs across the lifespan. These disruptors are just a key component that interact with other risk factors across life stages, including genetic susceptibility and time-sensitive windows. And we often think of these time-sensitive windows as fetus, children and adolescents, pregnant women, and older adults. So there are all kinds of other risk factors that may interact with these exposures to mitigate outcomes. And when we think of thyroid disruptive chemicals, a lot of work, including by Dr. Pearce, has been done looking at BPA, pesticides, flame retardants, PFAS, and heavy metals. And I just want to focus on heavy metals for a moment. The push to really look at heavy metals was around the 1980s, and it was explored because the incidence of thyroid cancer in volcanic areas such as Hawaii and Iceland were reportedly much higher than they were in other countries. And so then slowly Mount Sicily and other volcanic areas began to report this high incidence. And the thought was really that the eruptions of gas and lava and ashes were polluting the soil, and the vegetation and animals were getting biocontaminated, which then translated to the residents of that area. And in fact, there was a study looking at levels of heavy metals in thyroid specimens and in urine of residents of these volcanic areas, and there were levels of metals that were noted to be higher. But I don't know about you, but when I look at this picture, yes, there's this lava and ash, but I also see this big smog sitting above the volcano. And to me, that looks like air pollution. And I think we all have a frame of reference of what air pollution is. And air pollution is really defined by the World Health Organization as contamination of the environment by any chemical, physical, or biologic agent that modifies the natural characteristics of the atmosphere. And so, what is air pollution? And what is it really made of, and where does it come from? And so there's a variety of sources of air pollution, including our moving vehicles, our airplanes, our cars, our trucks, our industrial power plants. There's farming, and then there's the natural things that we can't control, such as volcanoes and wildfires. And when we think of the composition of air pollution, it's really made of gases and particles. And so the gases include things like ground level ozone, and this is emitted by cars and chemical plants and power plants. It's known to be harmful to our health. Nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide are formed by burning of coal, petrol, and diesel, and even natural gas and volcanoes. And then carbon monoxides, again, coal, petrol, diesel, and then volatile organic compounds are formed from burning of all of these things, as well as dry cleaning products. And then we have particulate matter. And particulate matter refers to a mix of solid and liquid particles in the air, which are too small to settle out onto the Earth's surface under the influence of gravity. And they're really characterized by their aerodynamic size. So coarse PM we think of as anything between 2.5 and 10 microns. Fine PM is less than 2.5 microns, and ultrafine is less than 1.1 micron. And these are teeny tiny particles that can only be seen with a microscope. Now, of all of the components of air pollution, ground level ozone and fine PM 2.5, which is what we call just PM 2.5, they have the longest atmospheric lifetime, and so they can build up over multiple days and spread by the prevailing winds over large geographic regions. And just to put it in a size perspective, so here's PM10, and it's pretty big. These are inhalable particles, but they get trapped in the lungs. And then PM 2.5 is pretty small, and so it gets inhaled and it gets absorbed into the bloodstream, and therefore is thought to be the most pathogenic component of air pollution. And it's often used as a proxy indicator for air pollution, mainly just it's very small due to its size and surface area. And so the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970 in an attempt to regulate the amount of all of the components of air pollution that are in our air. And so the EPA has placed monitors across the United States to measure various components, and the different colors represent what's being measured. And you can see that there are large gaps of where our monitors are placed. And there are about 1,900 monitors around the United States to look at PM 2.5. The World Health Organization has also established air quality guidelines, and unfortunately, these are pretty difficult for some areas to meet. And so if you're curious about, how the United States is doing, here are some of the most polluted cities in the United States. And if you want to know where you're going and what the air quality is, and if you're just curious to know, you can just go to airnow.gov, enter in your zip code, and it'll give you a map of what the air quality is. And it's always pretty bad after the 4th of July in the United States. You can also look on your iPhone, and when you pull up the weather app, if you just go down to where it says air quality right here, and then if you just click on it, it'll actually tell you what your primary pollutant is and how much of it is being measured. And you can imagine that this varies significantly at different times of the year. Well, we all know that air pollution is bad. Everybody, I think, knows that, it can cause lung cancer and acute and respiratory illnesses, has also been linked to cardiovascular disease and cognitive impairment. And the question is, well, what does it have to do with thyroid cancer? And how did we even start to examine the role of air pollution on thyroid cancer? And I think it was the unfortunate destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11th in 2001, which was tragic. And I'm sure we all kind of remember that day. I know I vividly remember what I was doing that day. But if you take a step back and look at it from an environmental perspective, you had combustion of over 90,000 liters of jet fuel at temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius that released this dense and intensely toxic atmospheric plume containing soot, metals, volatile organic compounds. And then the collapse of the towers generated a ton of particulate matter. And so PM 2.5 sample collection was actually initiated at a site in Lower Manhattan on September 11th. And they measured these hourly until the last fire was extinguished, which wasn't until December, and then daily until May the following year. And these levels were noted to be significantly elevated. There was not an elevated level of radiation exposure measured at this site, in case you're wondering. So there were about an estimated 60,000 people carrying out recovery and rescue missions, restoring essential services, and cleaning operations. And so since that time, those that were involved in this process are offered annual medical monitoring and treatment visits, which do include multiple imaging scans. And so there were 3 different cohorts that were created. There was the fire department cohort, the World Trade Center Health Registry, and the general responder cohort. And after 14 years of follow-up of about 57,000 of these rescue and recovery workers, there were significantly increased incidence ratios observed for several different cancers, including thyroid cancers, and it did not matter at what day that you arrived. There was another study that examined just the firefighters, and this was about 15,000 firefighters. And they compared the incidence of thyroid cancer in the firefighters compared to our SEER National Cancer Database, as well as an epidemiology project in Rochester, Minnesota, which was thought to be completely unexposed. And you can see that the incidence, especially in men, was much higher for those firefighters. And if you looked at the timing of development of thyroid cancer, there was an increased incidence seen early on, which is within the first 5 years, but also the incidence, the risk of developing thyroid cancer or diagnosing thyroid cancer went up later on. And so already this is slightly different than what we saw with ionizing radiation. Now, some of this, and there was no difference in tumor size when they looked at the World Trade Center exposed versus a cyanide cancer registry. And some of this is Dr. Micah Van Gerwen's work, who is also an environmental expert. And they have a Mount Sinai cancer registry comparing those cancers that they saw versus cancers that were exposed in the World Trade Center cohort. So no difference in tumor size, but when they looked at mutational status, there was no difference in BRAF mutations, but there was a difference in TERT promoter mutations. And after adjusting for various comorbidities and demographic factors like age, sex, race, and tumor size, histology, the World Trade Center group had a 7-fold increased risk of having a TERT promoter mutation. So it just got me thinking of, well, I pass this structure every day on my way into work. And this is, kind of how we know, or I know, people know that you're coming into the downtown Baltimore. And what's interesting is behind this structure, we have a Topgolf, our Ravens play at the M&T Bank Stadium, our Orioles play at Camden Yards, and right below this structure is a lot of low-income housing. So this is what it typically looks like during the day, but this is what it looks like really when I'm driving by in the morning. And so what it turns out is that this is called the Baltimore Wheel Liberator Trash Incinerator, and it's the city's largest source of lawsuits, contentious debates, because it is the largest source of air pollution in Baltimore City. And so we thought that we would take a look at our patients at our institution. So patients that were seen within our health system, we identified about almost 2,000 cases of papillary thyroid cancer, and then matched them to almost 4,000 age and gender matched controls. And then the truly innovative portion of our study, and I'm very lucky that I have experts next door at the Bloomberg School of Public Health that actually developed and validated an exposure assessment model to estimate PM 2.5 exposure. So this is a unique deep learning neural networks model, and it incorporates meteorologic assessment, satellite assessment, including aerosol optical depth and vegetation coverage, and EPA data. And as I showed you earlier, there are gaps in that EPA, the monitoring stations. So this was an attempt to overcome all of these gaps. So what this allowed us to do is create grids of a 3 by 3 kilometer radius, and it overcame that spatial coverage issue. And so what we were able to do was take each person's residential address, match it to a 3 by 3 grid, and then calculated a daily PM 2.5 exposure, and then extrapolated to 24 and 36 months of exposure. And so down below is kind of an output from that model for a particular time point. And here's kind of the geographic distribution of our papillary thyroid cancer cases. So after adjusting for confounders, conditional multivariable modeling demonstrated that for a 5 microgram per meter cubed increase of PM 2.5 concentrations over just 12 months, there was not an increased odds of papillary thyroid cancer. However, after exposure after 24 months and 36 months, there was an increased odds of exposure, and this was 18% and then up to 23%. So the odds of developing PTC increase with longer duration of PM 2.5 exposure. We then looked at a fully adjusted spline regression to evaluate the risk of PTC with increasing levels of PM 2.5 concentration. And so you can see that the risk of incident papillary thyroid cancer by level of exposure to concentrations increased as the concentration increased. We also did a subgroup analysis and demonstrated that current smokers had the highest risk of being diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and this was 35% more likely. We also know that there's a disproportionate burden of unhealthy air, and that many people of color live in areas where they receive a failing grade for the level of air pollutants. So we decided to look at socioeconomic disparity, and what's interesting to note is that the more or the higher your median annual income was, the more likely you were to be diagnosed with thyroid cancer, which is a little opposite of what we thought we would find. Now, around the time that we had published this study, others around the world began to publish and were publishing about the rates of thyroid cancer and even other cancers and their association with air pollution, components of air pollution. And that's the other thing that really prompted us to want to take a look and do a systematic review to assess the association between air pollution and thyroid cancer or nodules. And so we searched PubMed, EMBase, the Cochrane Library, Web of Science, and Scopus for articles that were published prior to March of 2024. And we wanted to just include studies that examined the major EPA criteria pollutants. So ozone, particulate matter, which would be PM 2.5 and PM 10, sulfur dioxide, nitric oxides, and carbon monoxide. And we wanted the studies to demonstrate a quantitative assessment of one of those pollutants and the outcome of thyroid cancer or thyroid nodules. So as you can see, we started with 1,294 studies and screened almost 900 studies to be able to include 11 studies that met our inclusion criteria. And I know that this is a busy slide, but the takeaway points from this busy slide is that these studies were from many different countries. The study designs varied significantly. Our sample size was pretty high in most of the studies. So if you tabulate it all, it's millions of patients. And the way that pollution was assessed was different for each of these studies. Despite that, of the 3 studies that examined the association between ozone and risk of thyroid cancer, so there were 9 studies that looked at thyroid cancer, they all consistently demonstrated a positive association. And of the studies that examined PM 2.5, they also all demonstrated a positive association between PM 2.5 and air pollution. There were only 2 studies that looked at PM2 or nodules and air pollution. And again, ozone and PM 2.5 came up again. Now, if we look at the magnitude of association, those that examined risk of cancer with ozone, you can see some were adjusted, some weren't, but the kind of combined association, which you can't really combine because the studies were done very differently, you can see anywhere between a 1.03 to 1.17 increased odds of thyroid cancer with ozone exposure. And similarly with PM 2.5, studies reported anywhere from a 1.18 to 1.23 fold increased odds of a thyroid cancer diagnosis. So we had inconsistent levels of association that were observed for carbon monoxide, PM 10, and sulfur dioxide. We assessed risk of bias using the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute Quality Assessment Tool. And most of the studies using this tool were fair to good. And if you just look at the PM 2.5 studies, they were assessed as being good. And similarly with ozone, they were good. The limitations of this kind of work are really the fact that we can't account for social migration. We are not being able to demonstrate causality or a mechanism. We can't account for indoor air pollutants or occupational exposures. And I think the other big thing is we can't account for genetic susceptibility. So just to summarize, I do think that there's an increasing evidence of an association between modifiable environmental risk factors, including air pollution and thyroid cancer, but we really need better studies to understand this association, incorporate these findings so that we can incorporate the findings into thyroid cancer management. And the other big question going forward is what is the best way to account for genetic susceptibility? How do we account for social migration or even indoor air pollution, so that we can assess all of these risk factors across the lifespan, or the exposome across, to understand what's happening and what we need to do from a public health level. I have a lot of collaborators and a lot of people that help do this work, and so I'd like to thank them, and thank you all very much. And I'm
Thank you, Dr. Mathur, for this incredible work and presentation. We're gonna jump right over to Dr. Pearce's discussion, and we'll come back for Q&A at the end.
So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today, and a beautiful paper that we've just heard presented. So as you've heard, this systematic review by Dr. Mathur incorporated 11 studies, more than 6 million study participants across all those studies. It's the first such paper to really assess the effects on thyroid cancer and nodules of the individual air pollution components. So I think this is really important work, and she and her group are to be congratulated. Why might these be an interesting question to study? You've heard this already a little bit. What are potential mechanisms for how air pollution could affect thyroid cancer and nodule risk? We don't have all the answers to that, but there are a number of hypotheses. One of them is that maybe this is mediated in part through alterations in thyroid function. And there's a fairly recent systematic review and meta-analysis that suggested that, in fact, air pollution may disrupt thyroid function, and perhaps some of that nodule and or cancer risk might be mediated, through these thyroid function disruptions. But there are other potential explanations. As you've just heard, there are a number of environmental exposures that have been postulated or clearly known to be associated with increased thyroid nodule or thyroid cancer risk. And as you've heard also already, the best studied to date is radiation. But there are quite a number of other potential exposures that are of interest. Particulate matter is what we're talking about today in air pollution, but others, including pesticides, brominated flame retardants, and probably the perfluorinated compounds or PFAS compounds, may be associated not just with disruption of thyroid function, but also perhaps with thyroid carcinogenesis. So again, we don't understand mechanisms, lots of hypotheses on the table. I have to confess, I stole this figure from a paper that looked at the association between air pollution exposure and lung cancer, and I've superimposed a thyroid in the middle. But the reality is a lot of the mechanisms that are postulated probably are overlapping here. So we know that exposure to air pollutants probably causes oxidative stress. We know that it may directly cause, DNA damage, strand breaks, and we also know that it likely alters epigenetic regulation. So altered DNA methylation, deregulation of transcription associated with up and down regulation of messenger RNA. There may be up and down regulation of cell cycle checkpoint proteins, DNA damage repair proteins, again, all of which will lead to epigenetic changes. And then finally, there's reasonable evidence that air pollution exposure may increase systemic inflammation, may also increase insulin resistance, and perhaps those help to mediate this association if it truly is causal. This is not specifically studied with relation to air pollution, but there's this interesting recent paper that looked at exposure to some other environmental pollutants, so phthalates, PCBs, BPAs, and demonstrated that they upregulated estrogen receptors in the thyroid, and that downstream of that upregulation, there were alterations in the RAS and AKT pathways that might be postulated to increase inflammatory response and increase thyroid cancer cell proliferation. And while these have not been directly shown to be related in thyroid cell lines to air pollution exposure, these have been shown to be associated downstream effects of air pollution exposures in other types of cells. So potentially plausible mechanisms. But this is a really hard question to study. The assessing air pollution exposures is not so straightforward, and you've heard about this a little bit already. The traditional monitoring stations, as you've seen, do not provide, spatial coverage across the globe. They tend to be concentrated in cities or areas, near power plants, places that are known to be high sites of pollution, but it misses a lot of geographic territory. More recently, some satellite estimates of particulate matter are being used, but those can have some are prone to error, apparently, if they're not cross-validated against this ground level monitoring data. And that can also, the satellite data can also be impacted by atmospheric conditions, weather, other particles in the atmosphere. In addition, we effectively can do ecological type study designs when we're looking at regional exposures, but it is of somewhat limited, we're somewhat limited in our ability to really hone in on personal level exposures to air pollution. That individual exposure, even within the same region, might plausibly vary quite a bit based on location, upwind, downwind from the pollutants, time spent indoors versus outdoors, personal activities. So by definition, there's the potential for some misclassification, I think, in any studies that are looking at air pollution as an exposure. And there have been challenges in some prior studies in looking at thyroid cancer as an outcome. So many of the studies to date that have looked at environmental exposures in relation to thyroid cancer risk have relied on registry data. This, by definition, is going to lead to an association with known thyroid cancers, but as we all know, there's a huge pool of unknown thyroid cancers, which may or may not be of clinical significance. But we don't necessarily, know all the thyroid cancers that are out there. We just know the ones that come to attention. And many of the studies that have looked at this have taken a fairly broad brush and just called thyroid cancer. But as already discussed, that's really not the case. Thyroid cancer comprises a number of different types of cancer biologies. So not breaking this down by subtypes of thyroid cancer, not breaking this down by tumor aggressiveness in terms of size or staging or metastases, and ideally, breaking this down by tumor genetics, I think would give us a lot more insight as to which particular types of thyroid cancer might be the ones that are, where risk is increased via these environmental exposures. And of course, all of these are really epidemiologic studies with the potential for a lot of unmeasured or uncontrolled confounding. So smoking may be a big confounder that isn't necessarily controlled for in all of the studies that are looking for these associations. Interestingly, smoking in some studies seems to incur higher risk of thyroid cancer, and there are other studies that seem to suggest it's protective, so we don't really know, but it's unequivocally probably a risk factor in the mix somewhere. You already heard that obesity is a big risk factor for thyroid cancer, and it may also be an impact of or impact effects of air pollution. So I think that's an important confounder that's not always controlled for. Anytime we're thinking about sort of large studies of thyroid cancers and thyroid nodules, iodine status, the presence of other dietary goitrogens are going to be potentially very important confounders, especially I think looking at nodules. And then co-exposures. People who are lower socioeconomic status or minoritized populations often differentially live in regions where there's high levels of air pollution, but also are often in regions where there are other types of pollutants that might be endocrine disruptors or might be thyroid carcinogens. So one example might be, for example, co-exposure to PFAS. None of us are exposed to single environmental contaminants that might have these effects. We're all sort of exposed to a whole collection of things by a variety of different mechanisms: inhalation, transdermal exposure, and ingestion. And then, with regard to who is being diagnosed with thyroid cancer, that's not evenly distributed geographically. You are far more likely to be diagnosed with thyroid cancer if you happen to live in an area where there's a lot of medical imaging and a lot of ultrasounds. Those tend to be clustered in urban environments. Urban environments are the locations that tend to have higher pollution levels. So to just demonstrate that, you've seen a couple of these similar maps already, but this is now a 10-year-old map looking at daily average air pollution exposure, and you can see that there's some real hotspots across the country, kind of in the industrial Midwest, the Southeast, and in California. This is a map looking at PFAS drinking water contamination, so entirely different thyroidal disruptor, but another chemical exposure that is known to be associated with thyroid disruption, disruption of thyroid function and thyroid action, but also probably associated with thyroid carcinogenesis. And I think if you look at this map, there's significant overlap between the regions with high PFAS exposure and the regions with high air pollution exposure that I just showed you. So again, makes the epidemiology a little bit trickier. You also have just seen this map. So this is looking at rates of new thyroid cancers in the United States. These are CDC data from 2022. And again, I don't think this perfectly overlies with the two maps I just showed you, but definitely there is some geographic variability in where these thyroid cancers are currently being diagnosed. And this may have something to do with that. This is a map of where the endocrinologists are in the US. So, this is me and my colleagues. We are not evenly distributed across the country. And you see large clusters of endocrinologists, largely in urban areas. But I would argue that where the endocrinologists are overlies a lot of the places where these pollutants are. And so you do have to wonder a little bit if some of the contribution to the association that's being seen might really be just related to the geography of where the detection is being done, as much as the geography of where these causal elements are. So very, very hard to disentangle in epidemiologic studies. And I'm not arguing that the association is not real. I think it's just a very difficult thing to assess because this gets pretty complicated. Other limitations of the epidemiologic studies that we have in the literature to date, as mentioned, different studies have measured different types of air pollution, and they are probably not all created equal in terms of their downstream health effects. Some of the studies done to date have had fairly small sample sizes, and then by definition, really all of the studies of air pollution exposure have had kind of ecological designs where we don't have an individual participant biomarker of any kind and have largely been retrospective. So what would the ideal study to examine this question look like? I'm not sure it's a feasible study, but in an ideal world, to truly try and unpack this association between air pollution exposure and the risk of thyroid nodules and thyroid cancer, you would like large-scale prospective data, and this might or might not be a study that would actually be fundable. In this ideal world, this prospective study would have really robust assessment of thyroid cancer, including not just, thyroid cancer, yes or no, but looking at the type of thyroid cancer, differentiated, non-differentiated, RAF-like, BRAF-like, and looking at tumor size and stage. And you've heard alluded to already, there's sort of increasing sophistication in the ability to really sort of assess exposures at least at the ecological level. So combining the satellite data with the on-the-ground sensor data provides probably much more robust estimates than just looking at either alone, and using machine learning models that can integrate all of these data, the weather data, the satellites, the on-the-ground exposure monitors, all probably adding substantially to our ability to really accurately hone in on exposures, but to really get at individual level exposures is hard and probably would require the development of low-cost sensors that could be used for personal monitoring to really sort of give you exact exposures that would probably also give you input about both indoor and outdoor air pollution exposures. But whether that would really be feasible in terms of cost and availability of appropriate sensors for a longitudinal prospective study, I don't know. And because there's a pretty long latency period for thyroid cancer, this would probably have to be a fairly long-term study. And again, whether or not that would be feasible or fundable, I don't know. I think other questions in this area that are important to think about are the effects of mixtures. Again, none of us is just exposed to air pollution in isolation. We are exposed to PFAS and phthalates and brominated flame retardants and environmental radiation and all other all kinds of other potential thyroid carcinogens and thyroidal endocrine disruptors. And so studies, ideally would account for hopefully a broad array of exposures. And certainly, I think if there were going to be investment in a large prospective study, one would want to look at a number of exposures together and try and assess the effects of those mixtures. And in terms of thinking of thyroid carcinogenesis, the historical model would be trying to look at a dose response effect and determine at what level exposures are safe, and what levels, if exceeded, might increase cancer risk. I don't know if this is true for thyroid carcinogenesis, but certainly for endocrine disruption in general, we don't always see kind of traditional linear dose response curves. Often, at least with effects on thyroid function and environmental contaminants, we see non-monotonic curves, curves where you may see actually different directionality of effect at high and low doses, for example. And that also, I think, adds to the complexity of future studies. So I think this is an incredibly important area to study. I think this has really critically important public health ramifications. But there is more work to do to really understand this better. And I'd like to just close by commending Dr. Mathur again for a really beautiful study. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Pearce and Dr. Mathur, for your presentations. This is incredible work. I am going to kick us off with a question, and I'm gonna just rephrase it just for clarity a little bit. And we're gonna start with this. Could increased access to screen imaging among higher income individuals account for the observation between income level and higher thyroid cancer diagnosis rates? So people in the audience found interesting how that inverse relationship was found between income and thyroid cancer and nodule diagnosis. Do you want to comment a little bit on that, Dr.
Yeah,
Mathur?
sure. We found that interesting too. And I think it may relate to people who have a higher income, may be more likely to seek medical care and seek expert care. So it is probably contributing. I don't know if we can completely attribute the finding to just increased detection, but I can imagine it does play a role that you're more likely to go see somebody. But the other thing that we are looking at now is nodule size, lymph node metastases. And it's not just people who, I don't think it's just purely increased detection.
Correct. I have a question of my own. So we spoke about the higher incidence of thyroid nodules and thyroid cancer, the higher incidence of local, regional, and also distant metastatic disease. Dr. Pearce very elegantly explained how it's very difficult to dissect those exposures. We're all multi-exposed to a couple of different factors, and that ideal study might not be feasible or fundable or will happen at any time soon. However, do you ponder, and I know that just based on these studies, we can't potentially answer this question alone, but do you think that places with high levels of exposure, you name it, iodine and radiation, particulate matter, and endocrine disruptors, should those be potentially down the line screened differently? Any thoughts?
I mean, I think that's the question, right? Like, is this something we should think about doing? Would it be beneficial? What would we be changing? And then, but I think the bigger question is, so the levels of air pollution that we found increase that risk of diagnosis, those are all acceptable limits by the EPA. So the EPA has mandated that these levels that we are finding this association between are okay. So I think that the bigger question is do we need to have better control? I also found it very interesting that when you look at those maps that Dr. Pearce showed, there are gaps in the Midwest, but there are also gaps of environmental monitoring stations in the Midwest. So we don't actually know what's happening there. And those are high industrial areas. The issue has been with those monitoring stations that all the trucking companies and Chevron have filed many lawsuits and won them against the EPA to avoid having monitoring stations, to avoid having to follow those strict regulations. So I think the bigger question is what can we do from a health policy standpoint? How can we make those regulations a little bit tighter before we jump to, do we need to screen?
Correct. Dr. Pearce, do you have any insights?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And, resources are finite. And so if you're going to sort of try and figure out where resources should be deployed, I absolutely agree. It's probably in the regulation and the mitigation of exposures rather than in, allowing those exposures to continue and then trying to find the effects downstream.
Correct. That is really interesting. I think about this in many different situations, and it always happens when I'm hosting. I am Mexican, so as you can see, our reality is a little bit similar to what you guys have in the Midwest. There's very big blank spots or places where we don't know how the exposure is running, and then you mentioned obesity, BMI, and other stuff in the mix where it's highly prevalent in places like us or in the rest of the world, not just in the United States. So it is very interesting how regulation is key part of what we have to do down the line. There's a question from the audience, and I am thinking this is in relevance to the low cost detectors that you mentioned for that study. It says, if you were to get data from people's iPhone, would you have a more accurate estimate of exposure?
I mentioned that concept and have to admit I am not an expert on the development of these sensors. So I think people are working on that, whether there is something that is effective enough and low cost enough to actually be feasible to use for a study. I don't know, but it's frustrating to study an exposure where we don't have a biomarker. We can't do a blood test or urine testing to necessarily gauge individual exposures to air pollution. So we are at the moment making do with what we know about regions, and it would, I think, be very much a game changer for the field if we had a better ability to measure individual participant exposures in studies. But again, whether that's actually feasible or not, I'm not so sure.
Thank you. Dr. Hu Chen from Mount Sinai is asking, any environmental reason why more young people are getting thyroid cancer? Is there any?
I think that's what we're trying to figure out. So I think with all of these exposures, there are time sensitive windows, and then it's unclear is there a threshold exposure? Is it magnitude? Is it duration? Is it, and I think Dr. Pearce had mentioned it's not always a linear relationship. So what is that relationship of exposure? And I think we don't know that yet.
Correct. There's you mentioned how radiation-induced thyroid cancer have distinct molecular signatures. TERT promoter was one of those that was found. Did you find any other specific, I'm not going to say mutations or genetic alterations, but I'm going to say characteristics that you might have found with different exposures, PM 2.5 or you name it?
We are looking. I will get back to you on that one.
We'll be excited to see what those results are. Additionally, in the early part of your presentation, you mentioned how we have shifted this paradigm of one size fits all kind of treatment to a more personalized kind of medicine towards thyroid nodules and cancer, and it's not the total thyroidectomy kind of approach right now, but we are doing, as you mentioned, lobectomies, active surveillance, thermal ablation techniques now. So how do you think about these new approaches in thyroid cancer treatment in regards to the rise in prevalence and the inevitable exposure to all this kind of factors that you mentioned before?
I definitely think we need to do more work, but in general, thyroid cancer still has an excellent prognosis. And I think that's the big thing, to step back and have that bird's eye view of it still has an excellent prognosis. Age especially, is important in prognosis, and there are things that we know impact prognosis. And so I think maybe at some point in the future, and when I always kind of make an analogy to radiation exposure, but it took us 50 years or so to actually, from the first time that the event occurred till now, it's half of a century to even come up with, oh, maybe we should reconsider doing a hemithyroidectomy for somebody who is a child in Ukraine, right? And so I think there's a lot of work to do. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface. But I think the good thing for us in terms of biology is most thyroid cancer still has an excellent prognosis and a very low mortality.
And I might add that what we're trying to understand are that there are probably two things happening simultaneously if you look at thyroid cancer epidemiology. And Dr. Mathur pointed this out in her initial slides. We've had this huge surge in incidence of thyroid cancer in the US and in many other countries around the globe. There's not been a huge surge in thyroid cancer mortality, but there's been a slight increase probably in thyroid cancer mortality and probably an increase in diagnoses in younger people. So we think probably two things are happening simultaneously. One is it's just about the diagnosis, and do you live near an endocrinologist, and are you getting medical imaging where you're going to find this incidentally? But also probably there is a more subtle increase in, sort of bad actor, the ugly ones you talked about, right? The thyroid cancers that really do cause harm. And in big epidemiologic studies, I think that's why it's so important to try and tease out a little bit better what thyroid cancers we're talking about. Because I don't really think we need to be screening for and finding all the little, micropapillary cancers that are never going to hurt anybody. But we do very much want to understand the risk factors for the cancers that are going to be the bad actors down the road.
Correct. This is really interesting. Just recently, about a month or so ago, a study similar to this out of China made a correlation between environmental greenness to the incidence of thyroid cancer and thyroid nodules. And they found something really similar, and they highlight, or they point towards a particular matter 2.5. There seems to be an association towards this kind of exposure. And then we go back and remember the World Trade Center 9/11 situation, and it seems to be like a common denominator. So right now we're speaking to the choir. We're speaking to more thyroid specialists in the forum. But what does a layperson do as an end user? Like it makes me ponder. We started using N95 masks throughout the pandemic. Does that change anything? Does that filter the P2.5 particulate matter, and could that change in any form the exposure we have? This is just food for thought. It's just an open question. What do you think?
So it's an interesting question. So two parts. So first, the greenness. And that is very an interesting concept of looking at the amount of greenery. So it turns out that if you light a candle, which produces PM 2.5, and you measure levels of PM 2.5 next to that candle, they're high. If you put a plant next to it, after a few hours, that level of PM 2.5 decreases. And so the thought is that somehow the level of greenery is helping to absorb maybe some of the outdoor pollutants. And so that's why other groups have started to look at levels of greenery and greenness. Does it mitigate or reduce the levels of outdoor air pollutants? But we don't know exactly which ones yet. And then your second question, which can you remind me what? The what?
Masks?
Oh, yes,
maybe?
Masks. Okay, so also interesting for me because when we're in the operating room and we're using electrocautery devices, those are heavy releasers of PM 2.5. And many of our surgical companies have developed instruments that have automatic suction on them to help reduce that risk. So if you're just wearing a surgical mask, that's not going to protect you from getting PM 2.5 exposure. And we've actually measured it a few times in the operating room with PM 2.5 monitors, and anesthesia gets just as heavily exposed as does the patient. But we are always there. But an N95, if you wore it for protection of COVID, that slide I showed where if you looked at the reference sizes, so a COVID-19 particle is smaller than a PM2.5 particle. So if you have a good enough mask, you probably can avoid the PM2.5. It's just, do we want to be wearing N95 masks? And that in and of itself created quite a bit of controversy just during COVID. And so yes, those are all great points and interesting questions and things I also think about.
Thank you very much. We're just about to hit the 9 o'clock hour. I want to thank you so much for carving out some time for being here with us, for sharing your insights. I want to congratulate you both on your work. And I want to invite the audience to tune in next week. We're going to have a presentation on real-world clinical profile, red mutation testing, and treatments on patient-related outcomes for MTC in Europe. So we're looking forward for that presentation next week. I want to invite you all to come back, and I hope you have a safe and happy weekend.